As I was reading the TWAB that was released this week, we discovered a myriad of different things. However, there was one thing that caught my eye. In the section discussing armor mods, where they talk about depreciating the Fallen and Hive faction mods, as well as restricting the Taken mods to the Last Wish raid, there was this paragraph that discusses why they are being removed from the game. And this very small line about creating a clear divide between the haves and have-nots was very disturbing because this is giving us, the audience, a clear dive into the minds of the people who are creating Destiny. Now, this was specifically addressing Gambit, but that doesn't mean that this area doesn't bleed over to other areas of the game, because if it was only pertaining to Gambit, then Bungie could simply have said the faction mods will be disabled in Gambit. From what this sounds like is that Bungie thinks that players having a non-zero advantage over other players is a bad thing. Sorry to say this, but Destiny is a game about loot, and when there is no relative difference between two pieces of loot, all the loot becomes the same, which leads to the current state of loot diversity in the game. This has me worried for Beyond Light, because if this philosophy is a large one, with the people making the design decisions behind Destiny, then we're in for another year of all the loot in the game being homogenized. The following can all be said similarly for Trials and PvP respectively. I'll just be using PvE for argument's sake. Sure, getting stuff like the Oracle Disruptor perks intrinsic to weapons or armor is good for the raids, but the purpose of the raid items should be for those items to be the best PvE items in the games. Similarly, for Trials, items should be the best for PvP. Items from a raid, for example, shouldn't only benefit you in the singular raid, instead those items should come from that activity and be useful and desired for much more outside of the raid, because they are very powerful. Destiny 2 has this issue since launch, where the raid loot is no more better than something someone can get from token slamming an NPC, and I see this philosophy as a heat-seeking missile towards less interesting and unique items. What happened when Bungie buffed 600 autos? They created a clear divide between the haves and the have-nots. What happened when Trials was introduced and you didn't have two people to play with? They created a clear divide between the haves and have-nots. What happened when Gambit Prime Armor was added? They created a clear divide between the haves and have-nots. Of course there is going to be a clear divide between the have and have-nots. That's in fact what you want to happen, because this means that there is a non-zero difference between loot. How can cool loot be designed if the philosophy of creating a clear divide between the haves and have-nots is considered a bad thing? I just don't understand why they're outright removing them. The faction mods, for example, already have a soft sunset date by sunsetting the armor from the raids that these things can be equipped on. Like, isn't it the point of sunsetting to make it to where things can be powerful in the game for a year? But using this philosophy, what's the point of adding in better things? It seems like Bungie is just strictly opposed from the idea of having a best-in-slot item. But that's impossible to not have a best-in-slot item. There's always going to be something that's better. Like, is Bungie just trying to homogenize the loot and trying to make it to where it's like, okay, you can be this super casual guy that plays public events, and then you can have this other person that, like, does trials and does raids, does flawless trials, and, you know, does all this heavy grinding, and the loot these two people are going to get are basically the same. What's the point? You should give the person that puts in a lot more effort into doing more difficult things cooler and better things. Like, let that person be better. They clearly understand the game mechanics a little bit more. And someone that's, for example, that's doing, like, public events and stuff, they're not going to need this tier of loot. Frankly, the top player doesn't really need this tier of loot. There's very little in the game that actually incentivizes you to have a specific build one way or another. It's just the faction mods are the best thing we have. Because, frankly, Warmind Cells and Charged with Light, they're really interesting, and the design behind them are cool, and they could be good things, but they have major problems. Like, Warmind Cells, for example, have this weird bug where the Warmind Cell just will disappear. Hopefully that'll get fixed with the whole mission and physics host thing, but I don't know. We don't really know how Bungie works or Destiny works as far as the code in the game. But, like, what is the harm in leaving these in the game? You can complete raids with white gear. I don't really believe that Bungie super playtests and balances their stuff. I mean, look at the Cypher drop rates currently during the Festival of the Lost. How could Bungie think that that's alright? Like, the drop rates. They already admitted that they got it wrong from the beginning, that they had to be buffed. I just don't see this being a positive for the game, restricting specific and powerful things to a specific activity. Because all that's going to end up doing is, like, the people that do the raid are going to stop wanting to Sherpa new people if these mods become necessary, or not necessary, but like just a convenience. You're going to start seeing less people trying to help new players into stuff like the raids. I mean, these are just my thoughts, but I don't see this being a net positive. I just seeing this as some weird thing that they're just saying, okay, we don't want these in the game. I think the best route would be to change them, maybe make armor and skibby special, maybe make barrier not be able to reproc within a cooldown or something like that. Like, give us more unique things. This is why people like these things, because they change the way you play. It's like, okay, throw a grenade at a Taken. Okay, so I'm going to save my grenade for when I see that Taken enemy that I can kill easily. You know? Stuff like this. It's just really disheartening to hear that they're doing this stuff, and I feel like this philosophy is not going to lead down the best way to make a looter shooter, because this is basically going to invalidate any unique aspects of loot or the potential of having best in slot items, which those will always exist. It's just it feels like they're trying to fight back against the idea of having a meta or best in slot items.